All right. For people that may not be up on the Crater disappearance, for people that might be a little younger and might not be as familiar with references to Judge Crater, before we discuss the circumstances of his disappearance, who exactly was he?
He was a very prominent man in New York City in the 1920s, very accomplished lawyer, and had just been appointed by Franklin Roosevelt to the New York Supreme Court about 6 months before he disappeared. He was also very active in Tammany Hall, which was the political machine that ran New York City at the time. And he was a rather prominent person. He made a name in the city's nightlife. He was a womanizer, loved nightclubs, loved Broadway plays. So anyway, he was a very prominent person in the city, which made his sudden disappearance from the middle of Broadway on the night of August 6th, 1930, just an incredible story. It was the primary disappearance mystery in the 1930s, 1940s, even up to the 1950s. It had huge name recognition. It's mentioned in cultural things like the Marx Brothers, a Marx Brothers play, movies. It had a real cultural cachet, which, of course, 90 years later, it does not have as much.
Let's talk about the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. You said it was August of 1930. Now, what was happening in New York at the time? What was sort of the backdrop, politically, legally, judicially, to what was going on at the time that he disappeared in August of 1930?
That's a good part of the research I did on this book, is just looking back to see what was happening, in the papers at the time. It was at the end of the Roaring 20s, the stock market crash of 1929 had happened, but the city and the United States was not yet into the Great Depression as we know it. It was still the last vestiges of the Jazz Age, the Roaring 20s. It was a time of prohibition, also a time of great violation of the prohibition laws, with bootlegging. The nightclubs were becoming very prominent, still very prominent, in the late 20s, early 1930s, where gangsters would be hanging around in the clubs with the politicians. A real mixed crowd of socialites would go there. Sometimes there was gunplay in the nightclubs. The lights would go out, and there would be shootings. So it was still, I would say, part of the Roaring 20s. Franklin Roosevelt had just been elected governor in 1928, and as I said, he was who appointed Crater, and he had his eye on the presidency. He had a plan, a well mapped out plan, that he was going to run for the presidency in 1932. And a lot of that, his campaign for re-election that fall, ties together very much with the Crater disappearance. There were beginning to be Tammany scandals popping up in 1929 and 1930. And, they would continue to pop up until Jimmy Walker was ultimately deposed in 1932.
For people that aren't right, okay, I was just going to say, for people that aren't familiar with Jimmy Walker, Gentleman Jimmy Walker, he was the former mayor of New York City that was removed as part of the Seabury Commission by Governor FDR.
Right. Exactly. So it was, but the whole 1920s were a very corrupt period, especially in New York because of Tammany Hall, which really had an iron grip on the city at the time. And one of the themes of the book is that New York was just about to change radically because of the Great Depression in the country. Transformations would begin in the city that would make it so that, in the book I say, if Crater had reappeared 5 years after his disappearance, he literally wouldn't have recognized the city.
Oh.
Tammany Hall had been deposed. There were all kinds of social and economic changes that I think Crater, if he had returned, that decade, would have just been stunned of how much his city had changed.
We're talking with Stephen Riegel. He's the author of the book Finding Judge Crater, A Life and Phenomenal Disappearance in Jazz Age New York. So you mentioned he disappeared in August of 1930. Who was the last person to see him? Where was the last place that he was seen? Under what circumstances was he last seen?
He was coming out of a restaurant on West 45th Street in Manhattan. He had just run into a friend of his who was with his girlfriend, flapper girlfriend, and they had dinner, and they all walked outside, and he hailed a taxi cab, and he got into the taxi cab. His friend and the friend's girlfriend walked down the block. That was literally the last time he's ever been seen or heard from, dead or alive. So there's a lot of questions where that taxi cab was going. Part of the reason that the case got off to a very bad start was his disappearance did not become public knowledge until almost a month after he got into the taxi cab. So the trail was cold to start out with, and they actually tried to find the taxi cab driver. They put in ads in the papers, and the taxi driver never was identified or located. So that was a major drawback for the New York Police Department, because the reason that it was delayed, the announcement of his disappearance, was his family and friends were certain that he was on a bender or something, and something that could destroy his judicial career, or that he was off with a woman, and they intentionally did not go to the police. And it just, that delay in a month really put them at a disadvantage from the start.
So, given what we know and the limitations of that investigation because of the delay in reporting the disappearance, what are some of the key theories as to what happened to him?
There's just been so many of them. They're probably the most accepted, because of his womanizing, was that he was blackmailed by a girlfriend. He was married at the time, but he kept a mistress in one of the hotels and frequented the nightclubs and the chorus girls lines and that type of thing. So that became probably the most prominent initial theory, that he was blackmailed and that something went wrong and he was killed. Another theory that especially his friends stuck to was he was a random victim of, he was thought to be carrying a large amount of money when he disappeared, and many of his friends said he just happened to be showed the money on the street, was robbed and killed. And then there are other theories that work he did as a lawyer before he got on the bench, particularly a foreclosure in a ritzy hotel on the Lower East Side, that his involvement as a receiver at the hotel, that there was some hanky-panky going on with the foreclosure, and that he was bumped off by some of the people involved in the foreclosure. Some people think he, as I said, he frequented the nightclubs where there were gangsters. Some people thought he was bumped off by an organized crime figure, Jack Legs Diamond or someone like him, because of his involvement in politics and the Tammany Hall machine, which was very allied with organized crime at the time he disappeared. So,
but was Judge?
And there's always people who thought he voluntarily fled and ended up living in Australia or China.
But Judge Crater was a Tammany person, right? So why would, if the mob was in league with Tammany Hall, why would the mob be responsible for his disappearance?
Well, because he may have. I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but he associated with some very prominent Tammany Hall leaders, district leaders who were very powerful at the time. And, another theory was that he was involved in the Tammany corruption, and the Tammany people were afraid he would talk. So he was silenced effectively. And they would have hired a mob man, gangster to bump him off.
And when he's referred to as the missingest person in the history of New York, what exactly does that title mean, if anything?
I've seen that quite a bit, and I haven't really seen an explanation whether he was more missing than another person who disappeared from the city or what. I never really saw where that came from.
Got it. Now, you mentioned Tammany Hall and the role that they played in New York politics and in the New York judiciary at the time. And if people just tuning in, we're talking about the disappearance of former New York State Supreme Court Justice Judge Crater. Was his disappearance a factor at all in the downfall of Tammany Hall?
There was the Seabury Commission, which a couple of years actually was started about when he disappeared, and that's often given credit as what broke Tammany Hall's back. But in my book, I really say that the Crater disappearance was really the big initial impetus to Tammany Hall's downfall. That it really, there was all kinds of political rumors that were, some of them involved Governor Roosevelt. Amazingly, in retrospect, you think of him as quite an upstanding man, but even he was sort of talked of as being involved in his disappearance. I don't give any credence to that, but they were very politically turbulent times when he disappeared, and I think his disappearance was the first nail in Tammany's coffin, so to speak.
Understood. Talking with Stephen Riegel, attorney and the author of the book Finding Judge Crater.